A History of Hispanic Achievement in America is the rich legacy of the 45 million Hispanic Americans living in the United States. It is a legacy that started 500 years ago when Christopher Columbus stepped ashore in the New World. It is a legacy of remarkable journeys of discovery by men like Francisco Coronado, Hernando de Soto, and Don Pedro Menendez. They were followed by others who carved out a civilization in the harsh, untamed wilderness of what would become the United States. It is a legacy that saw Spain's empire crumble, and in the mid-19th century saw Hispanics become American citizens. In the 20th century, there were great individual Hispanic achievers who fought for equality in education, politics, and business. This series is the untold story of Hispanic American achievements that are now part of the great American culture of the 21st century.
Welcome to this 6th episode of A History of Hispanic Achievement in America. I'm Patricia Lopez. The first half of the 20th century totally changed the world for Hispanics living in America. Hispanic culture would grow into 3 distinct populations: men and women of Caribbean descent who often emigrated to East Coast cities, those Hispanics whose origins lay in Old Mexico, and a small group of European Spaniards. All 3 groups were united by the Spanish language. As the number of these populations grew, they found themselves a new minority in America. And like Black Americans, they became isolated and faced the worst kinds of discrimination. They even lost their civil rights and were deported to foreign countries. Still, individuals from this population achieved greatness on the international stage. It was America's last war for a world empire, and ironically, it would be against the European mother country of all Hispanics. The result was that the United States gained the Latino colony of Puerto Rico and established a permanent relationship with the citizens of Cuba.
America opened the 19th century with one kind of expansion, manifest destiny, and closed the century with a new kind of expansion, imperialism. Many times before, Americans had moved into new lands and territories, Texas, California, Hawaii, establishing a powerful economic presence, a presence that would eventually cry out for protection from the homeland. In 1895, the cry came from Cuba. The economic interests were the American sugar growers. The threat was the Cuban revolutionaries trying to free themselves from their Spanish overlords. The new war hawks, Teddy Roosevelt and Commodore George Dewey, agitated for an independent Cuba. On April 24, 1898, Spain declared war on the United States. The United States responded by saying a state of war had already existed since the 21st. The Spanish-American War, which was later described by Secretary of State John Hay as a splendid little war, now began. In the Pacific on May 1st, Commodore Dewey and his flotilla of ships were visiting Hong Kong when he received word of the war. He immediately set sail for the Spanish colony in the Philippine Islands. There he encountered the Spanish fleet at Manila Harbor. In a matter of hours, the Spanish fleet was completely destroyed while only 1 American sailor had died. Teddy Roosevelt led his Rough Riders onto Cuba's shores in July. American and Spanish forces met at the San Juan Hills. Anxious for victory, mounted on a horse, Roosevelt, with saber and pistol in hand, led his troops in a charge up the ridge. Reaching the top of the hill, he saw the Spanish defenders flee. In Santiago Harbor, on a lazy morning, a second Spanish fleet attacked the blockading American ships. By noon, the Spanish ships were all destroyed. Another American force took Puerto Rico on August 9th, and the war was essentially over. Spain ceded the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to the United States, and Cuba became an independent nation.
George Santayana's brilliant philosophical and historical works would usher in a new age of American thinking. Today, he is considered to be one of America's greatest philosophers.
The young man who has not wept is a savage, and the old man who will not laugh is a fool. George Santayana, Dialogues in Limbo.
His full name was Jorge Agustin Nicolas de Santayana, but he is known to 21st century Americans as George Santayana. Along with William James and Charles Sanders Peirce, Santayana put American philosophy on the map. Santayana was renowned for his legendary wisdom and insightful writing, writing that was a harbinger of the 21st century's multiculturalism, writing that embraced the natural world before it became popular to do so, and writing that pointed the way to a spiritual life without having to be a religious believer. George Santayana was born in Madrid on December 16, 1863. At the age of 9, his family moved to Boston. Though he spoke no English at first, he would later adopt it as his literary language. After graduating from Harvard in 1886, Santayana studied abroad for several years. Then, using his brilliant intellect, he challenged all the great philosophical thinkers of his time. As a result, he was invited back to Harvard, where he taught from 1889 to 1912. While there, along with James and Peirce, he founded the school of philosophic thought known as American Realism. In 1905, he turned his lectures on the philosophy of history into his most acclaimed philosophical work, The Life of Reason. With this one work, he joined the ranks of Plato, Aristotle, George Friedrich Hegel, and Immanuel Kant.
Progress, far from consisting in change, depends on retentiveness. When change is absolute, there remains no being to improve, and no direction is set for possible improvement. And when experience is not retained, as among savages, infancy is perpetual. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. In the first stage of life, the mind is frivolous and easily distracted. It misses progress by failing in consecutiveness and persistence. This is the condition of children and barbarians, in which instinct has learned nothing from experience. George Santayana, The Life of Reason, 1905.
Ever a dark, enigmatic figure, Santayana left America for Europe in 1912, never to return. He called himself a wandering scholar, living first in England and France, before settling in Italy. In 1935, he wrote his best-selling novel, The Last Puritan. Santayana died in Rome on September 26, 1952.
For years following World War I, Hispanics from Mexico and the Caribbean islands were welcomed into the United States as millions of immigrants had been before them. Then in 1929 came a disgraceful period of American history, rivaling the slavery of blacks and the Jim Crow laws in the South that followed after the Civil War. During this dark period of 1930s, Hispanic Americans were blamed for the Great Depression, lost their civil rights, and even though U.S. citizens were deported.
It was among the most heinous acts of American history, ranking with the slave codes of the early English colonies, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and the Jim Crow laws of the South. This heinous act targeted a specific group of people, more than half of them American citizens, and branded them with the mark of non-American, of other. It was the Mexican repatriation campaign of 1930 to 1939. During this decade of the Depression, local, state, and federal authorities singled out nearly 2 million Mexican and Hispanic American citizens nationwide and deported them to Mexico. It was the single greatest instance of deportation America has ever perpetrated, and its effects are still evident 70 years later in the 21st century. Since the founding of the country, America's industrial and agricultural might has been built on the backs of cheap labor coming to the United States from other countries as slaves or immigrants. New York's Ellis Island was the gateway for millions of Europeans. San Francisco was the entry point for millions of Asians. But in the Southwest, access to America was a 2,000-mile-long border, a border in name only, a border that Hispanics had been crossing and recrossing for centuries. Following World War I, that border virtually ceased to exist for millions of Hispanics who came to the U.S. from Mexico and Central and South America looking for work during the boom times of the Roaring Twenties. Exempt from the immigration restrictions and quotas of the 1924 National Origins Act, they came to the U.S. filling jobs that Americans did not want. At the same time, Hispanic Americans who had been citizens of the United States since the Mexican-American War of 1848 prospered as part of the world's fastest-growing economy. Then, in 1929, Black Tuesday happened, and that same economy screeched to a halt. Practically overnight, 30% of America's workforce lost their jobs. The Hoover administration was helpless, and it sought out a scapegoat: Mexican labor. President Hoover stated that Mexicans took away jobs from Americans. As a result, Mexicans and Hispanic American citizens were singled out and targeted for deportation. In 1930, President Herbert Hoover endorsed the campaign called Mexican repatriation, which focused on areas with large Hispanic populations, mostly in California, Texas, and Michigan. Immediately, the Federal Bureau of Immigration, renamed the Immigration and Naturalization Service in 1933, launched raids to locate, identify, and deport Mexicans to Mexico in order to reduce welfare expenditures and free up jobs for white Americans. For the next 10 years, cities, states, and the federal government conducted the Mexican repatriation campaign, even sealing off Hispanic neighborhoods so that no one could escape. Not unlike the conditions that surrounded black families during slavery, Hispanic families were ripped apart, with mothers and fathers being sent to Mexico, and their children, American-born citizens, remaining in the United States. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of Hispanic American citizens, threatened by local, state, and federal officials, were forced to abandon their farms and homes and sent packing across the Rio Grande River. By the end of the 1930s, the Hispanic population in the United States was reduced by 1/2. Hispanic Americans would pay a terrible price. For the Hispanic Americans that endured this shameful campaign, they had no country. The country of their birth did not want them, and Mexico was a foreign country to them. While they might be legal citizens of the United States, they were not cultural citizens. They did not fit the mold of natural Americans. And for the next 2 generations, the many accomplishments of America's Hispanic citizens would be ignored. Indeed, Hispanic leaders, cultural icons, artists, and writers would fight against the prejudice that they were not real Americans. It would take 2 generations before this shameful episode of American history would begin to rectify itself. 2 generations before the sense of other would begin to melt away.
New Mexico has been on the cutting edge of Hispanic American involvement in the United States since the founding of the Santa Fe Trail in 1821. So it was only fitting that one of the state's greatest heroes, Dennis Chavez, would open the door for Hispanic Americans to participate in national politics.
In the 21st century, Hispanic Americans' rise onto the national political stage has been dramatic and swift. So much so that the Congressional Hispanic Caucus had grown into a powerful force in American politics. In the first 5 years of the new millennium, the old Hispanic Southwest could claim 8 congressmen and women, a senator, Coloradan Ken Salazar, and New Mexican Governor Bill Richardson, an early candidate for the 2008 presidential race. This profound rise of national leaders from the old Hispanic Southwest is the result of the abilities of one man, a man who showed that Hispanic Americans could lead and lead well. This man was Dennis Chavez, the first Hispanic U.S. Senator. Dennis Chavez was born in Los Chavez, New Mexico, on April 8, 1888. As a young man, he quit school to help his impoverished family. Even so, he worked hard on his own to achieve an education and to get ahead. After working in the engineering department for the city of Albuquerque, he went to Washington, D.C. in 1917, where he served as clerk in the office of the Secretary of the United States Senate, while at the same time going to Georgetown University's law school. He graduated in 1920 and returned to New Mexico. From 1930 to 1935, he served 2 terms as the state's representative to Congress. And then on November 3rd, 1935, he was elected to the U.S. Senate. He was a man of great courage, as one of the first to denounce the communist witch hunts of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Dennis Chavez died in office on November 18, 1962, as the 4th ranking member of the U.S. Senate. Ultimately, Dennis Chavez had shown to all Americans that Hispanics could lead at the highest level of government. In 1991, a postage stamp with his likeness was issued in his honor.
Without the engineering and scientific genius of Luis Walter Alvarez, the atomic bomb would not have been built in time to save the lives of millions of American soldiers and Japanese citizens at the end of World War II.
Oppenheimer, Bohr, Feynman, names most Americans associate with the U.S. government's super-secret Manhattan Project during World War II to develop an atomic bomb. But one man made the difference between theory and application, between success and failure. That man was Luis Walter Alvarez, the Thomas Edison of the atomic age. Because of his work, millions of American and enemy lives were spared in World War II. Because of his work, the world entered the atomic age, and America became the 20th century's first superpower. Luis Walter Alvarez was born in San Francisco, California, on June 13, 1911. He was named after his Spanish grandfather. At a young age, he was fascinated by tools and technology, even building his own radio, a radical new invention at the time. He received his PhD in physics from the University of Chicago in 1936. Then, at the beginning of World War II, while at MIT, Alvarez was thrust into America's war effort. He was responsible for 3 important radar systems: the microwave beacon detecting radar, a high-altitude bombing system, and a blind landing system that safely guided airplanes to land through rain and fog. But Alvarez's greatest contributions would be in the service of science in a new arena, atomic energy. In 1942, at the outset of World War II, a deadly race began, a race between the Americans and the Germans to see who could develop the atomic bomb, a weapon so devastating It could end the war immediately for whichever side got it first. The theory was simple: create a nuclear chain reaction that would explode with the power of a football stadium filled with TNT. The application, however, was difficult. How to trigger such a device? In 1944, Luis Alvarez went to Los Alamos, New Mexico, to work on the creation of the first atomic bomb. With the whole project in jeopardy, Alvarez engineered the trigger to implode a ball of plutonium to a supercritical state. As a result, the first successful atomic bomb was exploded on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert. Then 3 weeks later, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, ending World War II. The trigger for the bomb was just one of the many inventions Alvarez created that led him to being called the Thomas Edison of the atomic age. After the war, Alvarez returned to Berkeley, where he designed and helped construct the first linear accelerator used to uncover the mysteries of subatomic structure. While at Berkeley, Alvarez also built the hydrogen bubble chamber, which his team used to discover many subatomic particles. His scientific and engineering genius would lead to even more new technology: the development of color television, the identification of long-range alpha particles accompanying nuclear fission, the first spectral analysis of the element mercury, and a technique to X-ray the pyramids of Egypt. In 1968, Alvarez won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his study of subatomic particles. One of his most astounding discoveries came near the end of his career in 1980 with his son Walter Alvarez. Based on levels of the rare metal iridium, which spiked in geological layers 65 million years old, the two men proposed that a giant asteroid struck the Earth, obliterating the dinosaurs and giving birth to the age of mammals. By the 21st century, their theory was widely accepted. Even though Luis Walter Alvarez was the Edison of the atomic age, sadly, because his work was in the service of science, he never profited from his inventions the way Edison did. Luis Walter Alvarez died on September 1st, 1988. A few months before his death, a newly discovered asteroid was named Alvarez in honor of his and his son's work on impact asteroids.
Charismatic, athletic, handsome, and a fiery competitor, Ricardo Pancho Gonzales was a perfect media image of the new Hispanic American.
Legendary sports broadcaster Howard Cosell wrote of this magnificent tennis player: "Next to Jackie Robinson, he was the most competitive athlete I've ever known." Like other minorities, Hispanic Americans in the 30s and 40s found it nearly impossible to break into the white-dominated sports industry. Then in the whoosh of a tennis racket, Hispanics found someone to lead the way. So great was his prowess on the court that at age 40, while still playing Grand Slam tournaments, he would be inducted into the Tennis Hall of Fame. He was Ricardo Alonso Pancho Gonzales, and because of his legendary athleticism and popularity, he opened the door for Hispanic Americans to pro sports. Pancho Gonzales was born in Los Angeles on May 9, 1928, 2 years before the Mexican repatriation campaign, which forced nearly 2 million Mexicans and Hispanic Americans back to Mexico. Like many Hispanic Americans who lived through this terrible time, Gonzales would have to do more than the average American to prove he belonged in the United States, to prove that he was an American. That chance would come on his 12th birthday, when he would be given the key not only to make his own life a better one, but to prove to all Americans that Hispanics deserved the chance to be Americans. For his 12th birthday, Gonzales, who wanted a bicycle, received a tennis racket instead. Gonzales fell in love with tennis and played as often as he could. However, he was often truant from school, and as a result, was banned from playing in Southern California's boys' tournaments. But he continued to play on his own, and in 1948, as an unknown 20-year-old, Gonzales won his first Grand Slam event, the U.S. Championships at Forest Hills, New York. He repeated his win the next year. He then turned professional in 1949. He became America's Mr. Tennis. His fiery, competitive style of play, his charisma and winning smile drew huge crowds. He went on to dominate professional tennis in the 50s and 60s. Many sports historians say he might have been the greatest tennis player of all time. Indeed, he never took a tennis lesson and was the world's greatest natural player. Soon he was followed by Rosemary "Rosie" Casals. Casals won 90 tournaments, including Grand Slam events in singles and doubles. Her dynamic tennis playing in the 60s and 70s made her the first Hispanic woman superstar in sports. Gonzales retired from the tennis circuit in 1974 and then played on the Senior Grand Masters. He died from cancer on July 3, 1995. But he lived to see the rise of Hispanic superstars in professional sports. Lee Trevino in golf, Sammy Sosa, Roberto Clemente, and Juan Marichal in baseball.
In the 7th episode, we shall look at the 60s. It was the most turbulent decade for America since the Civil War. It was a decade that would usher in new movements in the struggle for civil rights for Blacks, for women, and Hispanics. It was a time when a new kind of Hispanic hero emerged in America. Thanks for watching A History of Hispanic Achievement in America. I'm Patricia Lopez. For information about how to obtain a copy of this program or the entire DVD gift set of A History of Hispanic Achievement in America, visit our website, www.ambrosevideo.com. That's ambrosevideo.com.